Hello, everybody. Thank you and welcome to this third installment in Rod Botsis and my conversation about the life of the beloved, another one of Henri Nouwen's books. And welcome, Rod. Lovely to see you again.
Always lovely to see you, George. Cold weather, warm hearts. What a joy.
Great. Okay, so just as a recap, in the last two sessions, this of course is the third that we've had this conversation, we've been talking about this book.
Yep.
This book was written by Henri to a secular Jewish man called Fred Bratman. He was someone who had very little connection with religion, with faith, and Henri is inviting him into a conversation, and he wants to talk about our life and who we are in God, how God regards us. And so in the first session, we spoke about the fact that Henri thinks the key phrase to describe our relationship with God is that we are God's beloved. And you pointed out last week that it's beloved with a big B. It's not a lot of little beloveds. We are individually loved, and yet as part of a community in which the one who loves does not compare. So it's not like you're a bit more of a big B and I'm a bit more of a small b. We're all the same big B, but I guess he loves us in different ways, exactly as we need to be loved. Is that the right starting point?
I think it's absolutely right. If we could rest in the fact that we, with all our peculiarities, are the beloveds, then we open up our hearts to other people and their peculiarities. And discover that love multiplies. It doesn't get diminished. It's not limited. Just wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. The unending love of God.
And then last week we went further into this book, and he uses what we regard as the communion motif, although at its heart it's just the sharing of a simple meal. And he takes the four actions, the traditional actions of communion that all of us do across the churches. We are taken as the bread is taken, and then we are blessed as the bread is blessed or consecrated or set apart. And today we move on then to the third action. And it's going to take us a bit of time, I suspect, to talk about this action because there's so much to talk about here. Henri says, just as the bread is taken and blessed, it's also broken. And he uses that as a metaphor for what happens with humanity and with human life, not so?
Yeah, I was thinking about the whole communion motif behind this and how we are struggling in this COVID time of having to not have services and have virtual communion and what that means, and how it just seems so hard for all of us. And even if there's the odd one that seems to work, there's just something odd about it because we want to actually be with people. And brokenness is so real and it informs the whole of our pastoral life. So when we kind of separated like this in virtual stuff, it kind of blurs the fact that we are all broken and we are all needing to hear we are beloveds. And that's for me a lovely entrance into what Henri's trying to communicate.
So one of the things that stood out for me as I looked at this particular chapter on brokenness is this line that Henri wrote, the sentence. He says, every life is in some measure a broken life. And then he goes on to point out that the great prophets of the Hebrew scriptures and the great evangelists of the New Testament were chosen, blessed, but also broken. Brokenness for Henri is part of the spiritual life. Is that true? Yeah. After 44 years of ministry, you find it?
No, it's absolutely true. I have held close to me as a model for ministry Jesus looking at people who were, quote, harassed and helpless, and then he had compassion on them. And I said that for me, ministry is the kind of compassionate study of other people's pain because they're harassed and helpless. And that for most of my life, I've had very little pain. But in fact, you discover that when you do have pain and own up to it at all sorts of level, and the last 3 years have been bad for me physically, that you have got to rely on being the beloved, or else very quickly things fall apart. And the evil one wants to seize on that loneliness, and the sense of brokenness means rejection, and it doesn't mean at all. It's just the human condition.
Yes.
And in that human condition is that we're also beloved.
Right. Now, the question that some might ask in approaching this chapter in the book is, what does Henri mean by brokenness? And so I found a couple of different references here. The first on page 71, our sufferings and pains are not simply bothersome interruptions of our lives. Now, that's an interesting one, because what Henri is saying there is implicit in the experience of pain is the possibility of meaning. There's something going on here that could possibly be or become meaningful. You know, it's not just pointless.
It's definitely not pointless, and I think it is, and it can become meaningful, as opposed to God has sent this brokenness to you. God has punished you in order to make meaning. I don't accept that. I want to link something else from another one of his books. I can't remember where, but he said that writing to ministers, that the interruptions in your life are probably more God's agenda for your ministry than the plans that you've laid for yourself.
Right.
Oh, and that's been an interesting one to see. If I can pause on that one and just think about it, then the interruptions are often other people's pain breaking in.
Yes.
And then I got a minister, and I realized there's real meaning then, absolute meaning, that the interruptions create meaning for all of us.
Yes, yes. That's also a struggle for me. So the other thing that I found here, which I thought was interesting, he talks about it is where we are most needy and vulnerable that we most experience our brokenness.
Yeah.
And that for me makes a connection between suffering and pain and things about ourselves that are vulnerable places. And of course, Henri himself had vulnerable places, and we're going to talk about one of those just now. But I mean, is that something you can relate to?
George, I think I was going to say all of us, but let me just talk about myself to make the point. Whatever glory is, let it go to Jesus. But I protect my vulnerable places. I don't think I'm unique in that way. And in fact, I think we're meant to share our vulnerable places, because when I protect them, they get the better of me. Yes. And I misinterpret all sorts of things that happen in that vulnerability. And it's not always a permanent thing that makes me vulnerable. It could be an instant. It could be, I don't know, just not be well, to be blessed is to be well thought of. It could be a snide remark. It could be a strange comment from somebody in a shop. It could be something that I've battled with my whole life and I've never really overcome. It could be all these kind of moments of vulnerability. Yes. And man, if I hold them and protect them, I really am all alone. Yes. And I believe with all my heart that that's the place that evil works, to pick us off when we're on our own, and then to run into us this constant hell-ish line that you are broken because you are rejected.
Yes.
So your vulnerability becomes proof of rejection, rather than just human. and therefore beloved, because he loves me.
Yes. I think it's the hardest thing in the world to as a leader, to expose one's vulnerability. And I think, I struggle with it, and many of our colleagues I know struggle with that. But Henri Nouwen was really keen on this, what you're talking about now, sharing our vulnerability. And of course, that phrase that has become synonymous with him, the wounded healer, leads one to a place where you can actually use your and I'm using use in a sort of not manipulative sense. You can use your vulnerability to bless others. You can facilitate healing.
Oh, absolutely.
Even as someone who is being hurt.
Absolutely right. But let me just tease you for a moment. You said as a leader, we protect our vulnerability, or we find it hard to express our vulnerability. What I'm suggesting is that our human condition is all of us protect our vulnerability. And that's why alienation is such a common experience in society, where we know deep in our hearts we're in society so we belong.
Right.
But the work of evil has been to tell us, well, you actually don't belong. And this antithetical fight that keeps going on in us. And the only way out is to say, I am vulnerable and I need you. And to discover you are as vulnerable as I am, whether you're a leader or not. And then the mutual sharing doesn't become, the depths of terrible depression. We both use this, but the discovery of healing, of absolute healing.
So then the other thing that Henri does is he connects our suffering, our brokenness, with the very brokenness of Christ. Jesus was broken on the cross. He lived his suffering and death not as an evil to avoid at all costs, but as a mission to embrace. We too are broken. We live with broken bodies, broken hearts, broken minds, or broken spirits. We suffer from broken relationships. How can we live our brokenness? Jesus invites us to embrace our brokenness as he embraced the cross and to live it as part of our mission. He asks us not to reject our brokenness as a curse from God that reminds us of our sinfulness, but to accept it and put it under God's blessing for our purification and sanctification. Thus, our brokenness can become a gateway to new life. Now, that's not from this book, that's from Bread for the Journey, but it's a connecting with Jesus and then a usefulness that comes from the brokenness.
This John chapter 4 thing of the simplicity of the request. Please give me something to drink. And we know all the layers of what's going on, after the fact. But she, in her brokenness, somehow goes back to the community, and the passage ends, many came to believe in him because of what she said.
Yes.
And the whole entrance into the dynamic of her healing and their salvation was the vulnerability of Christ saying, please give me something to drink.
Yeah.
And when I am not well with my wife or with people, I don't ask for help, George. I do it myself.
Yes.
In fact, my vulnerability says I'm going to do it better than other people. I don't need them.
Yes.
And I have this lonely journey, and nothing gets multiplied except my self-assurance and my arrogance. And that John 4 passage is quite different.
Yeah, I listening to you now, it reminds me of reflecting on that passage from a missional perspective. In other words, how can we learn something from Jesus in that passage about how we should witness to our faith? How can we share the gospel in a similar style? And what struck me is, as you say, his vulnerability. He's got no bucket. She's got the bucket. And, so often as an evangelist, as somebody wants to share one's faith, I think I've got all the cards in my hand. I'm on the high ground, and the listener, whoever gets to listen to me, must just be quiet and listen. And I wondered for a moment how much more successful our evangelism might be if we didn't put ourselves on the back foot and ask the person with whom we want to share the gospel for something, give them the superior position, acknowledge that they have a bucket and they have something to offer us. And then into that, we can then communicate the gospel in such a way that makes, that person, turns that person into an evangelist in their own right.
Absolutely.
I mean,
but the root then is to reveal some anxiety or some vulnerability or some need that we have,
Yes. Yeah,
I think. Go on.
The certainty we often come with is not always a pleasant thing to come into contact with. You know, if you face somebody with
I think the church,
an arrogant sureness.
Yeah, I think the church has got a reputation. I don't always agree with it, but that it has over centuries talked down to people. It has been the cathedral, the church to which people come in need, and the practitioners ourselves, the professionals, very seldom express need. And actually, people will respond when we express need. And it was so nice to help you. I had a flat battery the other day, and I thought, oh, what the hell do I do now? You know, do I get AA or whatever? And our little complex has got 20 people. We got a little WhatsApp group. I simply said, does anybody have a battery charger? My battery's flat. George, within 2 minutes, one of the chaps was there with, he said, listen, I've got brand new jumper cables. I've never used them. Let's open them together, Rod, and see if this works. And there was warmth. There was humanity. We were chatting to each other while this thing was being fixed. In a way, it's never happened in the 5 years we've lived here.
Wow. So as you, that's exactly to our point. You show vulnerability, and not fake vulnerability. You don't make up the vulnerability. I mean, Jesus was at the well. He didn't have a bucket. You know, it's not like he decided to hide the bucket, you know. So you show your normal brokenness, vulnerability, and the response that you get enables people to come into a partnership that was not there before. Greatly.
And it's sharing the vulnerability without being manipulative. So that's a little underbelly that one needs to watch and be careful of. That I'm not going to use my woundedness to manipulate, because that just goes wrong. You know, completely. So I started teasing you by saying the leaders find it hard to express vulnerability, but the truth is we all do, and we all battle with expressing it. Yet we know. When we've been helped, and it feels so nice to be blessed by someone else.
I do think that there are special people in the Word for whom this is a lot easier than for others, and they don't have such high mountains to climb in order to actualize the spiritual, practice. But anyway, Henri talking about brokenness. And he says on page 76, he talks about brokenness being an intimate companion. Yeah. How does that feel for you, Rod? Brokenness is your intimate.
I wrote down in my notes at that point, this is like a signature. This is something very much of who I am. And the reason that it's so intimate is no one actually knows what your brokenness is actually and what it's done to you. So we may think we know, what do I do with someone in the congregation who literally has never had parents? They were gone, and he was an orphan from early in his age. And he's a well-rounded person. But why is it that he would cry at every wedding rather than laugh at every wedding? What's going on there in seeing two people up front fall in love and later on become parents, and he doesn't understand that for him that was never there. He never had the picture in any way. So there are multiple things how people have had to deal with their brokenness, and in my own there's some peculiar things that I think, why does this actually make me so nervous? Why does this actually make me so hurt? And that's my identity. That's who I am. I've got to reach to the place of finally being able to say, it is who I am. It is who I am. Who I am. It is what it is. And once again, AA, to get in front of a group of people or one other and say, hi, my name is Rod, and here's my signature. I'm an alcoholic. That expression of my signature, that's who I am, allows people then to take my identity and help me deal with it. In fact, fix it.
Yes. The other thing I just wanted to point out is I don't think that it's essential that we should understand our brokenness. I know that sometimes psychologists say that we should, but I don't think it's necessary always to fully understand it, but to acknowledge it, to say, okay, I see, I'm choking up, I feel emotional, and it's touched something in me, I think it's okay to do that.
Well, let me ask you quite seriously, but with a warm heart, do you cry when you watch movies, George?
Sometimes, yes, I do.
Yeah.
And the girls
do you always know? Do you always know why you cry or why you find it hilarious?
No, it's not me who finds it hilarious. It's the girls who find it hilarious when I cry in movies.
Oh, sorry. Okay, but isn't that interesting that we just cry and we don't really know all the reasons why this is touching us? I'm not a great fan on any kind of nationalism, but when I hear a national anthem being sung by a large crowd, I choke up. Now, I don't think I need to understand that in order to benefit from this vulnerability. There's something beautiful going on there that the Spirit of God has touched in me. So I accept we don't need to understand it, but we can benefit from it and reveal it. And hey, even if the girls laugh, there's a nice dynamic going on there.
But
Look, Dad is human.
Sometimes one does understand why. For example, when somebody is vulnerable, even to the extent of cost to themselves, when somebody is generous, when somebody is giving of themselves in an authentic way, that moves me. And I can almost every time,
Yes.
if it's even if it's on a movie or something, if it's a deeply vulnerable and giving act, I'm emotional towards it, yeah.
And I think that, yeah, I think that's the Spirit of God reaching into us, whether we're Christians or not. And the God who so loved the world and gave is, at that moment, we recognize there's something eternally wonderful in what's going on here. It's just really, yeah. And you're healed by that, George. You're made more human by that.
Yes. So then I think it's important, it's not in this book particularly, but there's a point of connection here. Some of those who are watching this video clip will know that at some point Henri Nouwen left the academic life. He'd been teaching Yale University for a decade, and then Harvard for a few years, and before that in the Netherlands. So he'd been a kind of university teacher most of his working life. And then at some point he leaves academic life, and he goes to live in a community of profoundly disabled people called the L'Arche community. And the particular one was called Daybreak, and it was in Canada, Toronto. And
yes.
And he starts to work there firstly as their chaplain, but later takes on some responsibilities and starts caring for a particular young man called Adam, who's profoundly disabled.
Yes.
And Henri has to do, practical things like bath him and feed him and so on. And of course, this is a community of such like people. They have many assistants doing the same thing. But it really, first I think it breaks Henri before he's able to process that and come through.
Yes.
So it has a profound effect on him. And he experiences the brokenness of others almost as a break to himself. I'm sure you've read the little book, Rod, this Adam, God's Beloved.
Yes. Yes.
So what do you think of the brokenness?
That's
a different level, isn't it?
Yeah. Just a little sidebar quickly on the name. I've always found it interesting that he discovers this whole new life of vulnerability for himself through a child called Adam, the first one that would introduce life, as it were. There's something there that I think is quite lovely. I don't know why this has come to mind as I've been reading and again talking to you now, but I married a couple who were not church people, just as one does, and then they had a child, and they asked, could I bless the child? And there was an interesting discussion about what they actually meant and what we finally did. It wasn't a baptism and whatever. They weren't particularly religious. But within months, they discovered that this child had a terminal illness that was just terrible. Just terrible. So the child actually lives painfully, George, until she's about 4.5, 5 years old, but looks the shape and the size of a very damaged and malformed, at the most, 2-year-old. And somehow caring for this absolutely broken child, both sides of their family found each other, became human. There were difficulties, and love had fixed it. The community in which they lived became soft, and it was one of the most magnificent funerals I have ever been involved in at any level.
Wow.
And what produced it was this having to look and minister to, care for this broken body and child, and somehow realizing God has done such goodness in our lives. How can you not give to others? And this child has got such difficulty. These petty things that consume our time and our energy are just petty.
Yes.
So I have no doubt that his experience with Adam, I saw something of in this family. Even to the point of going to sit with them, with the undertakers, to talk about the funeral. They wanted to know everything. They wanted, and then they wanted this poor child dressed in a particular way, and asked me to help with that. And all that intimacy brought healing, as opposed to gouging sadness and hurt. Wow. And you would have thought the exact opposite. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great story, and I have similar stories in my own ministry of how some terrible thing ended up having such beautiful results. People allowed themselves to be wooed by God and held close, and they find strength that they don't necessarily have in and of their own resources. But in this Henri story, we discover, and it's also quite an understandable thing. Here's this bachelor, celibate priest, somebody who doesn't really have an experience of a nuclear family life, apart from the one in which he grew up, which itself was a bit, sort of regimented. And he, professor, at the university, probably a caricatured professor from what I hear about him from people who knew him. He was very impractical, couldn't cook much, burnt toast, couldn't even make soup or anything like that. And here he has to do an immensely practical thing for another human being. And he's terrified. Yes. He feels unqualified. And then in that community, as he writes in one of his books, nobody is asking him any profound theological questions. They just want to know if he's going to be in tonight. So they relate to him in a very sort of very plain and simple level. And he's not ready for that.
Yes.
He wants to be asked about the next book he's writing and things like that. But there's a beautiful quote here from the book. Page 112 going on to 113. Henri writes, Adam gave me a sense of belonging. He rooted me in the truth of my physical being. He anchored me in my community and gave me a deep experience of God's presence in our life together. A home in my own body, in the body of the community, in the body of the church, yes, the body of God. So Adam works his ministry on Henri, even as Henri himself thinks he's working a ministry on Adam. He discovers the tables have been turned. by no one other than the Holy
Yes.
Spirit.
So isn't it amazing that Jesus washed feet and then said we should do the same? And that somehow when people do really serve and don't draw attention to themselves, something beautiful happens in them. They become lovely people. And I think when we can enter into those places where we're not putting our tags, our number plates, our titles, our positions ahead of ourselves, and we just are ourselves, community grows.
Yes.
Just grows and deepens. And then you are able to risk a bit more. Yes, it is hard for the leaders to risk their vulnerability. And yes, it must be very hard to have come from his heights to caring for Adam. But the risk creates just volumes for the rest of us to identify with and therefore take risks and to discover, my vulnerability is not a wall, but it's a stepping stone. My brokenness is not something that separates me from others, but unites me to others.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. So it's our point of connection. It's an access point for us to invite others in, to recognize our dependence. Although dependence in the Western mind is a very dangerous thought. People don't like to think of themselves as dependent. I always had a battle when I taught Christian ed courses on aging and death and dying, that people were so intent on independence that they didn't recognize that dependence is what fits us for eternal life. Because in the hereafter, there's nothing we can do for ourselves. We acknowledge our life.
Very good.
Rob,
I've tried to say. Go on. No, you go on. That's fine, George.
This business of Henri and Adam is a kind of two-sided story, and I don't think I think it is appropriate to acknowledge both sides. This experience of looking after the young man was so profoundly affecting on Henri in a positive sense. Just the way we described it, he finds himself and he anchors himself in community and all of that. But it also spun him into a nervous breakdown. I guess what he wrote in the positive sense came only with hindsight. He really found it very difficult. And what emerged for Henri, having written all these beautiful books over so many years, was that he had not really learned the basics of what he was trying to teach, which I think is all of our story. It's okay to teach, but to actually have that thing take root in one's own life is a very difficult thing. So Henri, all these things come up for Henri, that he needs admiration. He needs people's, creative attention. He also has some relationship issues, which are much less sordid than the average reader thinks. But basically, as a priest, he can't accept a specific relationship. That's part of what celibacy means. It's not just the inability to marry or be in a sexual relationship, but it's also inability to prefer one person to the next. And that really, everything goes upside down for Henri. I mean, did you read that when you were reading Henri in this?
Yes, I've always, these things in his life and where he comes out, I've always kind of stood back from it a bit and tried to see, would this be predictive for other people, or is this his personal journey? And again, we don't know the level of our own brokenness. We certainly, therefore, don't know the level of other people's brokenness. So I don't think, and this is what I want to say, is I don't think that people must be frightened that if they revealed vulnerability and brokenness, that this would spin off into a breakdown for them. And that if they got into some serious serving of people who were broken, that did not mean that they would have to also become peculiar. I've got to be really careful about this example, but I have in the congregation a very sane and very wonderful woman. But if you knew what her job was in the police services with serious crimes, you would think, how does she stay sane? And she never talks about her job. She never tells you she's a policewoman. I've discovered odd things because I've been there so long, but she's like an angel, and the stuff she's having to deal with every day is horrifying. So I want to encourage people to say, you don't have to end up in a nervous breakdown. At the same time, I'm not frightened when people do. I think a nervous breakdown sometimes is an absolute gift from God to rest, to sleep, to be pampered a little bit by some people, because in the end we can talk about brokenness, but brokenness needs to be healed. It needs to be soothed. Yeah, I think it's just something that we mustn't be frightened of, because for Henry it did end up in an awkward place.
Yeah. Whenever I think about brokenness, I can't help thinking about the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, where it was possible to touch those wounds. For Thomas, he wanted to touch the hands and the side, and Jesus gave him the opportunity. And so those wounds were still there. They may not have been they may not have been painful. They may not have been, Jesus wasn't dead anymore. He was alive, but he had those wounds. And I can't help thinking that is an explanation of what's going to happen with us, in eternal life. You will be able to see the scars on us. They will be healed, but they will still be evident. And so our brokenness can be redeemed in that way. We can acknowledge it, give it to God, but it need not be a stumbling block to us anymore.
No. I love seeing every now and again in a movie someone who's got a scar on their body, a wound that's healed but it's scarred, and their lover, their wife, their husband, whoever, discovers it and then kisses it. Instead of being turned off by it, being revolted by it, there's this intimate moment. My brother once slammed the door on my little sister. We were all just little kids, fighting, playing, and it nearly severed her finger. And for years afterwards, such tenderness between them. Still now, he's 70 and she's late 60s. He will pick up her hand and look for that tiny little scar because he thinks somehow he caused it. And well, that's the healing of the brokenness. That it doesn't produce fear; it produces tenderness. It doesn't produce a revulsion; it produces intimacy. And that for me is a very wonderful thing. So in my mind is Paul saying, I want to know him and to become like him and to share in his sufferings. And I've always thought, what does that actually mean? Because I want to know Jesus. I want people to know Jesus. I want to be like him. But what does it mean to share in his sufferings? And George, if he was the most redemptive person that's ever lived, then I would want to copy that. And if that means I've got to get close to other people who suffer and share some of my own wounds, I want to take that risk.
Right. Sure. Okay. This notion that comes in the chapter of putting brokenness under a blessing. Henry talks about putting brokenness under a blessing. What does he mean?
Well, it comes also in addition to him saying befriend brokenness. So I suffer with these painful conditions that I have. Okay, so our dear friend Alan Maker tells me you should read this document that I've written about caring for people who are suffering. So I've got medicines on one hand that cost the earth, and I've got this document. They're completely different things. I must come under the blessing of the medicines and never really think about my pain, just take the medicines. And sometimes I wonder if they work. Or I go through the document that allows me to visualize, identify just where I saw. How am I sore? Where is it actually? And then to visualize the presence of Christ coming to that very spot on my body and giving me the ability to let his healing come into it. I'm befriending my healing, George, my brokenness. Just in the same way as when I'm really sore, one of the things that just helps, even if I've got to sit on the shower floor, is just let hot water roll over me. And I come under the blessing. And I don't pretend my pain is not there. I come under it. I befriend it in one way by visualizing it and asking for the Lord's help. And in another place, I just come under God's blessing. And I think there are places where the healing comes by saying, I am who I am. I'm an alcoholic, but there's a community around me. I am who I am. I'm a broken person, but Christ is present in its midst, and I am beloved, and I come under the blessing. And I understand that in my life. It's not always easy to do.
Yes.
Because we fight the independence. I want to be independent. Yeah. It adds for more pain.
Yeah, I think it's, and also, of course, Henry wants us always to remember that we're the beloved. So when we're in the midst of difficulty, suffering, pain, when we are feeling overwhelmed by our brokenness, Henry wants us to remember that we are God's beloved, and that all of this is in the context of that. And, you know, if we wanted to create any kind of a connection in the scripture, between suffering and belovedness, you could see the proximity between the baptismal account and the temptation of Christ. You know, his greatest trial and I guess his ordination experience or God's anointing of him.
Well, I thought of the baptism experience and jumping right over the temptations, which is a bit stupid, but I did, to Gethsemane because the word Abba comes in Gethsemane. And you think that's just quite amazing, that in the most awkward moment, there's this deep intimacy with the Father, and that's coming under the blessing, knowing that I really am the beloved, even at that place.
Sure.
Very helpful for me.
Right.
I loved it when he wrote this, and if I'm jumping ahead, then you just rebuke me and tell me to behave. But when he said of listening to the inner voice calling us beloved, and in this place where even small pains under the curse can be so heavy they lead to suicide, but great heavy burdens under the light become blessed. So what seemed for depressing me became a source of purification. What seemed intolerable became a challenge. What seemed a punishment became gentle pruning. What seemed as rejection became a means to deeper communion with God. Sure, I loved that, and I thought, I can identify with some of that. My life's been a spoiled one, but I can identify that with others, George, who've been vulnerable and have risked sharing their pain with me as a minister over the years, where they've come to the place of saying, this is not a punishment, but I am being gently pruned by God. Thank you for the saints who've been vulnerable towards us.
Right. Okay. So let me come then to our last point here. I want to go back to that question of brokenness being redemptive. And and think about the way in which Henry suggests that we can be stronger in terms of ministry, in terms of sharing faith, in terms of inviting people into a relationship with God, when we operate out of a sense of weakness, out of a sense of woundedness, of brokenness, of vulnerability. And he uses that term, the wounded healer, way back in one of his first books, to describe such a use of our brokenness. Have you found over the years that when you are vulnerable with people, there is a greater response on their part?
Always. There are some people who don't want their minister to be too human, but there are very few of them. Very few of them. Most people want some sense that you are completely vulnerable, like they are vulnerable. And that's why I think good preaching does need to be anecdotal. I think we have got to take the risk of some saying, well, you're just so censored, so self-centered, you just talk about yourself. Take that risk and talk about what is happening in your life. And even to the point of confessing things, I think it's okay to admit failure and to confess, depending on the circle. But I think it's also important to inculcate in the worship of one's congregation confession. I find it very disturbing to be part of other worship services or experiences where there's not a hint of confession. How on earth do you minister to anybody else, if you will not allow confession to be a common practice? How on earth do you get close to someone in woundedness when they are wounded because they don't know how to confess? Oh, so for me, I think being wounded involves confession at some variety of levels and inculcating a spirit of confession in the life of worship of the average congregation.
Yeah, I think that's vitally important. I did notice as a student once when I went to work in a particular congregation that confession was not on the order of service at all. And when I put it there, I was told that the previous minister, who then retired, thought that confession should happen before you entered the sanctuary. So you came having confessed, and then he took you from there. And I couldn't quite reconcile that. Because as you say, I think confession is vitally important. And also, not just sugarcoating confession, but real, pointed, considered confession that is relevant to the congregation. Each of us, and we must admit who we are. We're not perfect. And any illusion that we are is, of course, even perhaps a greater sin. Because then you're actually so covered with falseness that you don't even realize, your need of confessing. Absolutely. But yes, confession, I think, absolutely points to brokenness, and brokenness in this, certainly in the view of Henri Nouwen, is a standard expected condition of human beings. We are going to be broken. Yes. And don't you think it's interesting how he points out that even the most loving relationships have the capacity to break us, to hurt us. We just generally hurt each other. We may love somebody very, very much. We may do things that hurt them.
My other guru, C.S. Lewis, clearly said, if you don't want to be hurt, don't fall in love. And it's just a fact. Those close, intimate love relationships bring hurt, see hurt, reveal hurt that sometimes we can't cope with or can't cope with immediately. That's just a fact. That is our humanness. Hebrews 12 says of Jesus, for the joy that lay before him, he endured his pain and the cross. So we are to set our eyes on him. And because of his identity, knowing he was beloved, he could endure. And so, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and all the things of the world will grow strangely dim. Well, that's beautiful, and I like singing it at times. But actually, the writer to the Hebrews says, set your eyes on him who endured the pain.
Yes.
Because he could see the joy ahead. Right. And I think that is a recipe. That out of your identity, you own the pain, see the pain, hold the pain, live with the pain. But you also acknowledge that in the beloved, there's joy ahead. Because you're the beloved, there's joy ahead.
Right. Yeah, I can
identify. To live. Yeah.
It always strikes me that at the center of our faith, there is a death, a tragedy, and a brokenness. And if it were not for that death, tragedy, and brokenness, we would really not have a faith. That is the absolute center, that crucifixion. And if the whole world can be redeemed by that brokenness, then surely by my smaller brokenness and the admitting of that and the using of that in a way to bless and to love others, some smaller redemptions can take place. Surely.
Because he gave himself up. It wasn't forced. He was not sacrificed. He became the sacrifice. And that's why it's redemptive. And that's why all our attempts to do that. I'm going to take another risk. You'll know in the life of our denomination, we had lots of trouble with the associations and trying to get people to relate together. And in chairing one meeting that was very tense in it being called together, and in a very cold room, and there was tension before they even started the meeting, and I had to chair it. And to add to it, I was the only white person in the group. I prayed like mad beforehand about, Lord, what our wretched and sometimes blessed practice of having a little devotion before the start of a meeting. So, you're going to read a text and say a few things. What is the reality here? There's like war going on. And I clearly heard the Father say, don't preach, just wash their feet. Oh, I struggled with that. Eh? Yes, I struggled with that. So in the end, I succumbed. I'm not going to say a word. I'm not even going to open the Bible. And we were in a facility, and I got there ahead of time, and I bought a beautiful kind of receptacle that could get your feet in quite nicely. And I bought some soft, lovely body wash that smelled nice, and I got a few fresh towels, and I said to the people, when I want this thing filled with warm water, please have it ready for me. So I start the meeting, and it's just as tough as ever, and it's cold. It's horrible from the start. And I say, for our devotions this morning, we're going into the next room. Please follow me. And in we go to the next room, and there's nothing there but a circle of chairs and this bucket with beautiful smelling soapy water and a pile of towels. And I sit and I tell them, I'm afraid the Father has clearly said, no preaching. I will just wash your feet. And then we'll go back to the meeting. It's like consternation, You're the moderator. So I didn't even take my shoes off at that point. I left them on, but I began to wash the feet of each person next to me as we went around. And I said, if you don't want your feet washed, then don't take your shoes off. Just sit there quietly, and I'll just move on. I got to one woman whose shoes were on, and I knelt in front of her, just knelt. And she stared at me. And I moved away to go to the next person. And then she bent down and took her shoes off. Came back, washed them, finished them all. Someone in the group said to me, can I wash your feet? I said, certainly. George, we walked back into the room and there was peace. It was the tension and the problems that were facing us simply were not present.
Yes.
We made progress. And I keep thinking, and I've told the story several times, still get emotional. I keep thinking nothing happened that was scriptural that morning, except everything was scriptural. It was vulnerability, doing exactly what he asked us to do. And it left all of us unable to become the role of master when we got back into the meeting.
Yes.
We all wanted to serve one another. that was a miracle in my life, George, to watch that happen.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay, Rod. Well, this has been a great conversation.
Absolutely.
We've taken it from the beginning of the book, which identifies us, each of us, as God's beloved. We've had a look at that simple meal where the bread is taken, blessed, broken, and now next week we must continue and see how, just as the bread is sent out or given, you and I are also not taken for ourselves. We are taken to be given. We are blessed to be a blessing. And I guess the story is incomplete without that, because it's at that point, the given point, that we really do embrace the community into which we've been put. This belovedness could be just a treatise on George and Rod, taken, blessed, and broken. But now we have to talk about being given away.
Absolutely. And I give thanks for all you've given to me, George.